The Olympics have just passed. You might have seen this meme circulating about Dionysus. People got a kick out of the fact that so many Christians were upset about the opening ceremony, thinking it was mocking the Last Supper, when it turned out to be another painting relating to Dionysus and the Olympian gods. Somebody made some bullet points about Dionysus, saying the following: that he had a divine father and mortal mother, was sacrificed, died, and resurrected. Wine symbolizes his blood, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles, turned water into wine at a wedding, was associated with a purple cloak and a crown of thorns, was said to be twice born or born again, was born of a virgin on December 25th, and was called Holy Child, God of the Vine, had 12 disciples, and rode in a triumphant procession on a donkey. Dan McClellan did not like this. He wrote, "As far as I know, the only things on this list that are true are that Dionysus had a divine father and a mortal mother, that he performed miracles, and that he was the god of the vine and viticulture. If you think I missed something, please identify the specific passage in the specific text where the tradition can be found associated with Dionysus." Pretty much everything on this list is made up. There was iconographic and symbolic overlap between Dionysus and Jesus in the centuries that followed the development of Jesus' tradition, but these claims derive from a brand of mythicism that insists that the whole story of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection was entirely fabricated based on pre-existing deity traditions. Well, Dan, I have some sources for you.
All right, let's see it.
The fact that Dan McClellan, who calls himself an expert in ancient religion, does not know about Dionysus' sacrifice, death, and rebirth is so bizarre to me. Diodorus of Sicily, Book 3. There's a lot about Dionysus in here. First of all, he compares them with different gods like Osiris, Sabazius, even comparing Zagreus to Horus and saying that they both resurrected. Uses the word Anastasis for resurrection in the Greek. Check it for yourself. But just to get this out the way, that the resurrection and the two-born thing happens, it says, in the same manner, the account that Dionysus was born of Semele, they trace back to natural beginnings, offering the explanation that Thuoni was the name given to the ancients of the earth. Furthermore, the tradition that Dionysus was born twice of Zeus arises from the belief that these fruits also perished in common with all other plants in the flood at the time of Deucalion. And when they sprang up again after the deluge, it was as if there had been a second epiphany of the god among men. And so the myth was created that the god had been born again from the thigh of Zeus. Book 4. Some writers of myths, however, relate there was a second Dionysus, who was much earlier in time than the one we have just mentioned. For according to them, there was born Zeus and Persephone. Dionysus was called by some Sabazius, whose birth and sacrifices and honors were celebrated at night in secret. Now, some of these are so specific that I have a problem with them. Why does this person decide to make these so specific is beyond my comprehension. Some of these are half true. For example, he does turn water into wine, but it's not at a wedding, so not sure why they put that there. He does wear a purple cloak, but not a crown of thorns. He wears a crown of ivy. It is true that he's twice born, and not sure why Dan left that one out. That's pretty much one of the most obvious ones. He is called the Divine Child. He is the god of the vine. He did not have 12 disciples, but he does ride into Athens on a donkey. It's barely 101 level knowledge that Dionysus is one of the gods who was sacrificed, dies, and resurrects in so many sources that I'm surprised he even put himself out there like this. However, I'm not that surprised. This is the same guy who doesn't know how to pronounce Dionysus' name, Semele, in which he calls her
Semele.
Calling Semele Semele is like me calling myself an expert in Hebrew Bible and pronouncing Isaiah Isaha or something. Just demonstrably bad on his own part, and this sets the tone for the rest of the 2-hour video. So not to waste our time with me pulling up all these different sources of Zagreus dying and resurrecting as Dionysus, I can name 3 primary sources right off the bat, and that is the fragments of Callimachus, Euphorion of Xalxis, who are both from the 3rd century BC, and Diodorus of Sicily from the 1st century BC. all of them predating the Gospels. The fragments of Callimachus and Euphorion are preserved in the Etymologum Magnum. They are pretty close to the same. Callimachus refers to him as Dionysus-Zagreus, where Euphorion just calls him Zagreus, but then when he comes back from the dead, he's Dionysus. Both stories give the narrative of Zeus impregnating Persephone, who's called the Chori. Persephone gives birth to Dionysus-Zagreus, or just Zagreus. Hera devises a plan to send the Titans to rip apart the new baby, who was just called the Divine Child, and also given the title of heir to Olympus, and was wielding the thunderbolt. The Titans come, dismember Dionysus. They eat Dionysus as a sacrifice. The Orphic hymns reflect this sacrifice in the golden tablets that date to the 4th century BCE. Is even considered to be an animal sacrifice, just like Jesus as a sacrificial lamb. A kid, I fell into milk. Welcome, thou who hast suffered such suffering as thou hadst never suffered before. From a man you have become a god. A kid, you have fallen into milk. But next, in all three of these stories, Diodorus, Callimachus, and Euphorion, either the heart is saved by Athena or Apollo, is given to Zeus, who then puts it into a potion, gives it to Semele, who is immortal. Semele drinks the potion, they make love, Semele gets pregnant of second-born Dionysus. Once again, Hera devises a plan. She tricks Semele into going to see Zeus. She sees Zeus's godly form. She dies of the thunderbolt. However, Zeus is able to take the premature birth of Dionysus, sew him up in his leg until he is ready to be born, and then Dionysus, who's in the bosom of the Father, is born from the lap or the bosom of the Father. That is how Dionysus dies, resurrects, becomes a god, and is reborn.
Hey everybody, my name is Dan McClellan and welcome to my channel. This channel is here to try to help make the academic study of the Bible and religion a little more accessible to the general public, as well as to try to help combat the spread of misinformation about the Bible and religion.
There's a little bit of a hesitation on and religions, and I think I know why. I do not think that Dan McClellan should continue to call himself a scholar of Hebrew Bible and religions. I think he needs to cut that last part out, which I will demonstrate in this video. But I'm going to let Dan McClellan explain to you his credentials as he does in the Danny Jones podcast.
My first degree was in Ancient Near Eastern Studies. That was at Brigham Young University, and I emphasized Biblical Hebrew, but I did a minor in Classical Greek. Then went away to the University of Oxford, where I did a master's degree in Jewish Studies, and I wrote my master's thesis there on textual criticism of the Septuagint. Then I went and did another master's degree at a university up in Canada called Trinity Western University. That was in Biblical Studies, where I started working on cognitive linguistics and wrote my thesis there on the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. So when they talked and thought about gods anciently, what exactly were they thinking about? And then I did my doctoral dissertation under the watchful eye of Professor Francesca Stavrokopoulou at the University of Exeter.
We're just going to talk about the Bible,
Yeah.
and I want to learn more about it. First off, who wrote it and when?
Some people think that Moses wrote it, which he didn't, because Moses didn't exist.
And that was on concepts of deity and divine agency. So now I'm looking at what is a god, but also what is a divine image? And how does, like an idol, how does that work? What was the logic they were using for how this could be both the deity and not the deity? And then I looked at how we can better understand some features in the Bible. During the COVID lockdowns, I was at home with not a ton to do, and I started seeing people posting TikTok videos on Facebook and Instagram and elsewhere where people were talking about religion and the Bible, and I kind of was wondering who's in charge over there. And so got an account and went and checked out TikTok and saw that there were not a lot of credentialed experts who were commenting, but there was a lot of discussion going on about religion and the Bible and stuff. So I thought I might as well just kind of position myself as a bit of an umpire calling balls and strikes out there. So my channel is all about my motto is data over dogma. The idea being that I'm going to try to center the data, what we can say about the Bible and religion based on actual research, and try to prioritize that over and against the dogmas, whatever they may be, from whichever side they come, whether they're related to identity politics or they're related to one's own personal interests or things like that. So, and I was kind of expecting to not find a big audience for someone who kind of stands in the middle and tries not to play for either team, but to my surprise, there are a lot of folks who are interested in that, and so it's been a fun ride. But
And so when you position yourself as the umpire calling balls and strikes over what you call data or dogma, you better be on point.
And you said you also had, what was your degree in classics?
so I did a minor in classical Greek.
A minor in classical
Yeah.
Greek. Okay, so that's interesting. So you do have some knowledge of classics, and you did study classics a bit.
A little bit, yeah, although I transitioned into Septuagint Greek, New Testament Greek, and that's
Okay.
kind of where I've spent most of my time.
Now, I have a 2-year degree in economics. That means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of economic scholarship. And if there's an economist writing a peer-reviewed article on something, I will have no say in it. I don't try to put myself out there as someone who's an expert in economics. I just know the basics. A 2-year degree is pretty much equivalent to a minor in someone's first degree, which would be a bachelor's.
So I did a minor in classical Greek.
A minor in classical
Yeah.
Greek. Okay, so that's interesting.
Having a minor and a bachelor is like having a 2-year degree, associate in something. You have some 101 classes under your belt, maybe some 200 level classes under your belt. Basics. With Dan McClellan being a bona fide, straight up expert in Hebrew Bible studies, smuggling in that little minor in your first degree of classics.
A lot of people who study the Bible will also study what's going on in the classical world because
Oh, really?
Of the influence. Yeah, it's you frequently see a lot of overlap. Classicists going into biblical studies, sometimes going into classics. So there are folks who try to straddle both of those fields, but that's a very difficult thing to do.
Dan's knowledge of classical world is none, zero, non-existent. From what I gather from watching him, not an expert, but you don't have to be an expert in any field to know when someone's full of shit. You can just be a fan. Let's say we're talking about Star Wars. You're not an expert. You don't work on the set of Star Wars. You didn't write the movie. You're not a Star Wars scholar, but there are Star Wars scholars, believe it or not. But if you've seen every single movie, right? You know the movies. You watch them 3 or 4 times each. You actually have a group of friends that you talk to on a regular basis, and you debate Star Wars with them all the time. When someone comes along and says that they're a Star Wars expert, you're going to know right away if they're full of shit or not. Be able to call that out anytime.
The ancient Greek has like 1.5 million unique words, and the ancient Hebrew only has 8,000 unique words. And he was explaining to us, he was showing us the differences. And there was like, for one word in Greek, when you translate it to Hebrew, there's like 3 or 4 words just to equal that one word in Greek.
So there's a couple of things there. One, there's nowhere near that many Greek words. There are ancient Greek. You've got, I think, 275,000 is the estimate, more or less, of how many ancient Greek words there are. If you look at all Greek, ancient, medieval, and modern, you've got 400,000 to 500,000. And
What's that lexicon website where we can actually look it up? And show?
Thesaurus Linguae Graeca,
Yeah. Okay.
TLG.
Can you find the TLG and is there a way you can just search for unique words in a certain language and it'll tell you?
You have to have an account, I think, to do the most robust kind of search with that.
Oh, do you?
But I think you should be able to do some pretty basic stuff.
Okay.
With,
See what you can find, Stephen. Okay. Anyways, you can keep going.
And then there are 79,945 words in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible alone. So
79,000?
79,000, yeah. So I think he may have heard 80,000 somewhere.
Oh, 8. He said 8.
Yeah, I think he may have mistook 80 for 8 because the Hebrew Bible itself, which is not all of ancient Hebrew, like there was a lot of Hebrew writing and speaking outside the Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew Bible itself has 80,000 different words in it.
He gave an exact number, 79,945 words. It's funny that the next day after this interview went down, Dan McClellan posted the following post on X. He said, yesterday I recorded a podcast interview in which I responded to the claims related to ancient Greek and Hebrew made by Dr. Ehrman on a previous episode of the podcast. One of the claims we discussed pertained to the size of ancient Greek and Hebrew lexicons. Dr. Ehrman was paraphrased as claiming 1.5 million words for an ancient Greek lexicon and 8,000 words for ancient Hebrew lexicon. I suggested 1.5 million significantly overestimated the ancient Greek lexicon, and that it was somewhere around 250K for ancient Greek and around 400 to 500,000 for all Greek from antiquity to today. In the previous interview, though, Dr. Ehrman had said precisely that it was 250 to 500,000 words. That's accurate. So as long as we're taking about all Greek from ancient to modern Greek. It was actually in a later live stream on his own channel, responding to the same TikTok videos of mine, that Dr. Ehrman claimed that it was somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million to 1.5. Just to be clear, the inaccurate claim did not come from the previous podcast interview. It's on the claim that the ancient Hebrew had 8,000 words that I made an embarrassing mistake. Somehow, I got it in my head that the Hebrew Bible had 80,000 distinct words in it, but that's wildly inaccurate. That's full of shit, my man. You did not say 80,000. You said 79,945.
And then there are 79,945 words in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible alone. So
79,000?
79,000, yeah. So I think he may have heard 80,000 somewhere.
Oh, eight. He said 8.
Yeah, I think he may have mistook 80 for 8 because they're...
You gave an exact number. This is not getting a decimal wrong. This is claiming something, finding out that you're wrong, and then trying to backpedal and say, no, I knew it the whole time, but I just made a quick error and I just got the digit off. It's 80,000 or it's 8,000, but I said 80, but I meant 8, but it's really 80,000. No. You don't get to get off that easy. You're wrong. You made an exact, if you said 80,000 in the podcast, I would not be talking right now.
There are 79,945 words in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible alone.
But you made a claim, and your honesty is on the line now. This is dishonest. You made an exact number. When that number turned out to be wrong, then you tried to round it up, and then therefore make it seem like you just were off by the digits. Somehow I got it in my head that the Hebrew Bible had 80,000 distinct words in it, but that's wildly inaccurate. I ignored the intuition to check myself there and just leaned into it. After the interview, it was bugging me. So I looked it up and realized I was way off. The reality is, it is around 8.5 thousand words, though the Hebrew Bible does not stick with the entire lexicon of ancient Hebrew. Full of shit, in my opinion, in trying to get out of a hole that they deserve to be in. You had all this time, and you knew that this was one of the big things that you were going to talk about. He knew for weeks that Danny was going to ask him about this exact question. That's why it's the first question he asked him. He was not prepared. He did not do the research. He did not know this. When you're being dishonest in any way, that's a problem. This is simple. When you make shit up, and then when you try to dig yourself out of a hole, it doesn't look good. It makes me no longer even trust what you're saying anymore.
Why don't you see any Hebrew? You see Greek in the synagogues. No, bring it. So Theosebea is what this guy Job has. And I want you to see that this is that Saba of Zeus or Theos. Good. Keep going, Neil. Right? Now, how does this translated, right, on the Masoretic side? You just use an adjective for being afraid. And you drop in Elohim. Look, Theosebea is taken by the Hebrew back translator and done literally. They have no internal concept of Theosebea or Saba.
All right, pause it there. All right. So what is he saying there? Do you understand what's...
Yeah, Theosebea is God-fearing. Okay. It was a title that was used. You do see synagogue inscriptions where somebody, and God-fearer was a title that was used in the Hellenistic Jewish world to refer to somebody who was a Greek or a Roman, was not Jewish, but supported the Jewish community. So it was like, he's a friend of the Jews. He's a God-fearer.
That's not the only time that word is used. That word is used way before the Septuagint or Hebrew Bible even existed for pretty much anyone who's religious in any way. They could be a follower of any god, and they can be called theosebes. It literally means reverence for God. That's like what it literally breaks down to. People translate it as God fear, but to say that the word only means friends of the Jews, people who are friendly with the Jews, that is a very narrow way to look at this term.
God-fearer was a title that was used in the Hellenistic Jewish world to refer to somebody who was a Greek or a Roman, was not Jewish, but supported the Jewish community. So it was like, he's a friend of the Jews. He's a God-fearer.
That is somebody who just knows Hebrew Bible and maybe some New Testament, who has never came across this word in any other text, that would think that this is what the word means. It's not just what it means. It only means that in a certain context. Even here, I will admit, that's what it means. But I'm just wanting people to realize he's making a claim, a broad claim about a definition of a word with a very narrow scope on where the word comes from. Here's Herodotus in the mid-5th century BCE using that exact word, etikai putamenos ton proison eījnαι theosebia tude enekin anabibese epi ten purin. Or perhaps he heard that Croesus was pious and put him atop of the fire to find out if this divinity would deliver him from being burned alive. The word being translated from theosebes is pious, which, if someone really wanted to, they could have said Croesus was God-fearing. But it doesn't matter. It could be reverence for the gods, God-fearing, pious, or religious. To say that this word theosebes only means friends of the Jews and people who worship our God is a very narrow definition, and something that would only make sense if all of your knowledge and your texts that you know are just the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and nothing else. And it can mean that in certain contexts. In the book of Acts, it's used in that context, and some other places in the New Testament, it's used in that context. But that's not what the word just means. It's just one of the ways that the word is used.
And so you have like funerary inscriptions where on somebody's headstone it says, "This is Dave, God-fearer." So that just meant he was a friend of the Jewish people.
Theosebes.
Actually, no. If you find a random tombstone of a guy named Dave who was a God-fearer, you can't just conclude that he's a friend of the Jews. He could have been a God-fearer of another god. You have to find out, is this in a Jewish cemetery? Is this a Christian cemetery? You have to find out the context of what's going on in that cemetery before you just conclude that Dave the God-fearer is a friend of the Jews. Again, that's not the definition of this word. Dan is incorrect here.
Yeah, or it might say this synagogue was built thanks to the help of so-and-so, Theosebes, the God-fearer. So that's a title that developed within Hellenistic Judaism as it's interacting with the Greco-Roman world. So it's not unusual that there would be a title that is unique to Greek because that title developed from the interaction of Jewish and Greco-Roman individuals. The notion that this Hebrew didn't pre-exist that title, that this is a translation from that title is nonsensical.
No, again, as I pointed out in Herodotus, that word was already being used long before Jews and Greeks are interacting. That's not a word that develops as Jews and Greeks interact. That's not correct. And that's a perspective that would come from someone who only understands Judeo-Christian literature and nothing else. In fact, let me just put my money where my mouth is. Let's give you some more examples of this word being used in religious contexts that have nothing to do with Jews or Christians. Sophocles' Oedipus. Etas gi Athenas phasi theosebestatas. There's that word, theosebes, in the female genitive form, and it means if they say that Athens is most devout towards the gods. Once again, devotion to the gods, having nothing to do with Jews or Christians or friendly to the Jews. Once again, in Plato's Cratylus, he uses the same word. Agathou hai theosebus asebis genetai, through the mouth of Socrates, which is a person who is good and pious becomes impious. Once again, having nothing to do with being friendly to Jews or God Yahweh or Judaism or Christianity, nothing.
That title developed from the interaction of Jewish and Greco-Roman individuals.
The word didn't evolve from Jews and Greeks interacting. That's not true. Dan just made that up because in his narrow view of what he knows, which is Judeo-Christianity, that's all the times he sees that word is in that context. So he's then doing the thing that he criticizes Ammon for. You know, they criticize Ammon for seeing drugs everywhere, right? That's what they say. Ammon is a scholar of ancient drugs, and he's seeing drugs everywhere. But it's ironic to me that Dan, who only knows Hebrew Bible stuff, is making a claim that this word only means interaction between Greeks and Jews, and being a God-fearer means you're friendly to the Jews. That's false. That's not what that word means. Here's another example from Aristophanes' Birds. Hernibi, Theosebes, Usian, Epiboan. It is imperative that I sing another sacred chant for the right of the lustral water that I invoke. The sacred chant. The word sacred is used as Theosebes. So you don't need God-fearing, you don't need Yahweh, you don't need Judaism, you don't need any of that stuff for this word at all. That word predates that, and it has different context. In Xenophon's Cyropaedia, the word right here is oide theosabos, pantes sune pekesan, megale te phone. But all reverently, there's the word reverence, responded with a loud voice.
A word like theosebea, which means is to one who fears God. So that's one word in Greek, right?
Right.
And then so if I say
it's a compound word though, because it's theos and the verb for fear. So it's two of them being put together into one word.
Because it's theos and the verb for fear.
Sebase is an adjective like eusebes, impious, and phobos is a noun, which is fear. So theosebes can become God-fearing by definition, but it doesn't break down in the way he just said, God and sebes, theos being God and sebes being the verb for fear. That is not correct. You would not pass an exam if you wrote that down for the definition. That is not correct. Sebomenos is a worshiper and a phobumenos is a fearer. Those are middle passive participles. Phobumai is to be scared and afraid. The verb for fear would be phobumai or something like that. Not sebase, which means have reverence, which is an adjective.
Isn't it so funny that we can be so far in the future and still be arguing about what the hell they're talking about? It's kind of goofy.
Yeah, well, and it's unfortunate because, it still means life or death for some people, what the Bible says.
It is an interesting point that he makes because it means life or death for a lot of people around the world. And when you're holding up the two pillars of Christianity is special and unique and has no influence from any Greek mythology or philosophical pagan stuff, and the Old Testament is this ancient Bronze Age text that goes back all the way to Sumerians. When you tell people that stuff, you make them think that this book is magic. Even if you take away all the miracles and say that we don't know for sure if Jesus actually resurrected. Just giving them those two pillars alone makes the book special, unique, and magical.
It's perplexing to me how people can be a scholar of the Bible and dedicate their lives, to go to school and to get a master's degree in studying the Bible. It's a science. You're trying to figure out the truth about something. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me so counterintuitive that you have all of these people who are Bible scholars, but they're also subscribing to the very belief of the thing that they're studying.
That is one of the things that causes me an awful lot of heartache is the fact that there are folks who ostensibly want to understand this as it was understood anciently, but conveniently it always seems to line up with what they want it to mean today.
Right. Everything conveniently lines up to Christianity becoming this liberal great religion where all the prophets were basically social justice warriors, and Jesus was basically like a hippie communist. He didn't hate gay people at all, and all the stuff about Paul and Romans about the gay stuff probably interpolated somewhere. Paul probably didn't actually say that. It just happens to line up that way. Makes you wonder. Maybe. But conveniently, it always seems to line up with what they want it to mean today. Oh, this is the point that I'm going to come back to on a lot of different occasions in this video, because he's going to eat his own words here when he says, conveniently, it always seems to line up with what they want it to mean today.
Just intuitively. Not even on purpose, just the way the human mind interprets language, we're going to be nudged in the direction of an interpretation that serves our interests or makes sense to us. And for a text like the Bible, which there's so much power and authority and values wrapped up in it, I think it's just so incumbent on people who do make it their life's work to study the Bible to distinguish what I want the Bible to mean from what I think, what they originally wanted it to mean. Because if it just conveniently always happens to be the exact same thing, there's a problem, and your math is wrong. It's because they lived in an entirely different world anciently. They don't magically hate all the same people and magically love all the same people and magically need all the same things.
Are you religious?
I am.
You're what sort of religion do you follow?
I'm an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I'm a Mormon. Okay. But and some people discover that and they're like, "You deceived me." Well, I've had a pinned video on the top of all of my social media accounts that introduces myself and says that, but also says I make a very concerted effort to ensure that my religious beliefs, my dogmas, don't influence my academic positions, and I'm very good at that.
I actually agree for the most part that Dan is very good at this, but I don't think he's perfect at it. I do think that there are things that he does defend Christianity from, and one of them is the idea that Christianity is being influenced by the same cultural influences that other 2nd century and 1st century cults are being influenced by, that somehow Christianity is in a special group by itself and is exempt from any of these other cultural influences that are rampant at the time period and the cultural milieu that Christianity grows out of. For example, the same cultural milieu that you see the cult of Ion rise out of, or the Mithraic cult that rises up during the same time period, the cult of Isis in the 2nd century, different mystery religions that are scattered about, whether it be the Samothracian mysteries or the Eleusinian mysteries, that all seem to be centered around salvation. The idea that Christianity can have anything to do with mystery religions is so asinine. I don't think he understands mystery religions. He says that mystery religions are secret, and that's why we don't know them. That's such an amateur thing to say about mystery religions, because we actually do know quite a bit about them. They're written about, and we have archaeology, and it tells a picture that mystery religions have this in common. They all are centered around salvation in some way, initiation, whether it be by water immersion or drinking some sort of drink like a Eucharist, the devotion of a god, the hope of an afterlife. We have the language of the mystery itself in The Ancient Mystery Cults by Walter Burkett, Chapter 3, Theologia Mysteries, Myth, Allegory, and Platonism. It has long been held that mystery myths are a particular type, that the suffering god, the appropriate Greek word, patheia, sufferings, and this, connected with rituals of grief, mourning, in a nocturnal setting, is the proper content of mysteria, already in Herodotus. We do find the abduction of Persephone, and indeed the death of Dionysus, Attis, and Osiris. There is a sequence of mourning followed by joy in the mysteries, whether those in Eleusis, Meter, or Isis. The grief of Demeter ends with the return of Persephone, and the festival ends with exultation and the brandishing of torches. At the festival of Magna Mater, the Dies Sanguinis is followed by the Hilaria, the day of joy. The mourning rituals of Isis end with the finding of Osiris, the water of the Nile. We have found, we rejoice together. Firmicus Maternus describes a mystery scene in which, after days of lament, in the presence of an idol lying on a litter, light is brought in, and a priest anoints the throats of the mourners, saying in a whispering voice, "Be confident, Mustai, since the god has been saved. You too will be saved from your toils." It is unclear to which cult he is referring, but it is evident that the fate of the initiate is modeled on the fate of the god, as represented in myth and ritual, following the peripety from catastrophe to salvation. From the standard text Greek Religion, chapter called The Mysteries of Demeter and Corey by Kevin Clinton. One of the legacies of the mysteries, mediated through Plato and Platonism, is the mystery language of Christianity. Terms like mystical, mysticism, mystagogical, etc. all go back ultimately to the Eleusinian and other ancient mystery cults. The Greek word mustes, from muian, to initiate into religious rites. That's what it's being used as in the 2nd and 3rd century BCE. It comes from a religious context having to do with initiation. It has to do with mysteries hidden from people by God. People who are initiated get the secret wisdom, they get access to a secret realm, they are saved. These are the commonalities we find in mystery religions of the time period of the 1st century. Christianization of mysteria went from secret rites to secret doctrines revealed in Scripture. So there is a Christianization happening, but the word is still developing from the mystery religions itself. There's a Eucharist, there's baptism, there's initiation, and in the Eleusinian mysteries, you do water immersions. There are baptisms. There were people called baptai in Corinth. You do have drinking of a special drink, whether it be the kukaion or the soma or the haoma. That is also a thing in the ancient world long before Christianity comes along. Even in Old Testament literature like Daniel and the Wisdom of Solomon, you get that word in Greek, mysteria, right? There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteria. You get that from Daniel. Daniel being written in the 2nd century BCE. Right in the middle of this stuff, right? And then Paul talking about in Corinthians, we speak of God's Sophia, hidden in a mysterio. God decreed before the ages. Now, most Bible scholars don't get this. It's not just Dan that does this. This seems to be a sort of I want to call it a dogma in particular scholars that study the Bible. I don't know if it's because there's a lot of Christians involved in those circles, whether it be the SBL or all these different circles of Bible scholars that are sort of like in their little cliques. Bart Ehrman is another one. Bart Ehrman does not understand what this means. Just to give you an example of about the level that we're dealing with Bart Ehrman, he writes an article almost 8 years ago confusing Demetrius Poliocrates with Diogenes. It's not just the typo, he does it twice in the article, which means he thought his name was Diogenes. This is one of the most prominent characters of the ancient Hellenistic world, written about at length by Plutarch. To not know someone like this, I don't know if I would trust anything you say when it comes to the classics at all.
A course that you've recently produced about Joseph, and I was fascinated to hear about this because it's not something I've even considered before. Tell us about the course.
Yeah, so this is a course. It's a 2-lecture course that I gave here in the in the season about the birth narratives, and this course was about it's called Jesus, the Actual Son of Joseph, the New Testament Evidence.
And that's why I was so fascinated to hear that you've got this New Testament evidence for Joseph being the actual biological father of Jesus, and like you say, evidence from the New Testament.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence are you talking about?
Pay a bunch of money to buy my course that's going to tell you what the Bible says about Joseph. Internal evidence about Jesus' father.
Paul doesn't say anything about Jesus being born of virgin, even though he says a lot about Jesus. But either do any of the other books, including Mark, as you pointed out, our first gospel is silent about it, and John, our last gospel, is silent about it. It doesn't say anything about virgin birth, and both of them call Joseph the father.
By the way, he even makes a mistake in this. You're the one doing the course. How are you making mistakes? He says that Mark talks about Joseph as the father.
And both of them call Joseph the father.
That is false, Dr. Bart. Mark does not call Joseph the father. Mark never ever mentions Joseph. Joseph's not mentioned by any of Paul's letters. He's not mentioned by the first earliest gospel of Mark. He shows up in Matthew late in the 1st century, possibly to fulfill the prophecy of the son of Joseph, Messiah. There's a Ben David Messiah. There's a Ben Joseph Messiah. The two Messiahs motif goes all the way back to the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran. For some reason, this is never brought up by Bart. He also never talks about the primary sources from the early 2nd to middle 2nd century about Jesus having a biological father named Pantera. He uses late 18th century sources to wave this off as a mistranslation of the word Parthenos. However, nobody's ever made this claim except for Christians in the 18th and 19th century. So if you're going to do a course on Jesus' biological father and not even talk about this, what a ripoff and what a waste of money. For this to be the top of the line scholarship is kind of sad.
He's also called the son of Joseph. He's in Luke's gospel, which has a virgin birth story. After the virgin birth story, Joseph is called his father. Your father and I have been looking all over you, says Mary at one point. And so those are some of the things I talk about in the course.
Also, another possibility why Joseph is the name of the father is due to Joseph being one of the 12 sons of Jacob who goes to the Gentiles, who becomes a king among the Gentiles in Egypt. So there's a lot of things pointing to why Joseph is the name of the father. Almost all of it points to fiction. None of it points to there being a real guy named Joseph, except for Bart claiming that there's internal evidence using the Bible to prove the Bible.
So then do you have a historical hunch yourself as to why you think this historical Judas might have betrayed Jesus?
So there are a number of explanations that people have given. I think the idea that he did it for the money is probably just something later to show that he was a thief, to kind of to put him in a more negative light, or to say, he's filled with the devil. I think that's a theological explanation because he did something so evil as betray Jesus. Historically, I think it may be, I mean, there are various options. One option that I think is fairly attractive is that he did in fact think Jesus was going to bring in this new kingdom.
Yeah, sure.
I think that, I think this saying of Jesus that you find it in both Matthew and Luke, where Jesus says, you 12, he's talking to the 12 disciples, you 12 will be seated on 12 thrones ruling the tribes of Israel when the Son of Man is ruling. You 12 will rule the 12 tribes. I think Jesus imagined that he would be the king and he'd have his 12 disciples serving under him in this kingdom.
The level of nonsense is through the roof in this conversation. They're just completely speculating on thoughts about Jesus as if that's how historical inquiry works. We just speculate on the thoughts about people who are 2,000 years dead, who wrote nothing down, who we only have legends about them, barely even can prove he existed. But we're going to speculate on their plans about a kingdom that doesn't exist. Therefore, Judas is an actual real person because he would have been mad that the kingdom didn't actually come. Am I the only one who's not blown away by the level of nonsense that's going on here?
It may be that Judas is disappointed, or he's upset, or he thinks he's been misled. And we don't know. We can't get into his head, but that would make sense that something disappointed him about the direction things were going. And so he turned rebel to the cause.
Luckily, of course, with all this ambiguity about who Judas exactly was and why he betrayed Jesus, lucky us, because now we have access to the secret conversations
yes.
that Judas and Jesus had with each other
yes.
around the time or just before the crucifixion.
Yes.
Quite recently, is rediscovered.
So never in this conversation is it brought up that Judas has the same name as the Judas from the Old Testament. Yes, the Greek Septuagint, his name is Judas. He's the one who betrays Joseph, who, like Jesus, has to descend into the underworld, or in the dungeon for the case of Joseph, rises up again, becomes second most high to Pharaoh, just like Jesus becomes second most high to God. After all the parallels that are drawn from in the Gospels to apply to Jesus, the one about Judas being one of the most clear examples of drawing from Genesis motifs. Judah and Judas. Judah betrays Joseph for shekels. Judas also betrays Jesus for shekels. This is so well known to be a messianic prophecy. It's all over the Psalms too. In Psalm 41, 9 through 10 says, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus literally hands Judas bread to eat before he betrays him, fulfilling Psalm 41 to a T, to an exact T. Psalm 55, 12 through 15 is even more obvious that there's going to be a Judas somewhere in the Jesus story. Verse 12 says, "If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God, as we walked about among the worshippers." Judas is a composite character about messianic prophecies about the one who will portray either Joseph or David being applied to Jesus. But for some reason, in seminary and Bible school land, it's Judas probably existed because the New Testament says so.
And I get accused all the time. People post comments on videos saying, your Mormon is showing. And, and it's always wrong because...
No, it's actually mostly right when your Mormon does show. People are not stupid.
They're confusing something that looks similar on the surface if you squint at it, but don't really understand either in any detail.
Yeah, when you don't understand anything in detail, like you just demonstrated by not knowing what theosebes means.
My positions that I share on social media are just strictly scholarly and are not aligned with my religious beliefs.
The idea that Christianity is special and needs to be put in its own category, and anyone who tries to point similarities between Jesus and Dionysus, who is a god that dies and resurrects, that's zeitgeist. That's James Frazier nonsense.
Where are your biases?
My biases, the biggest one I have is something that I also state in my intro videos, is that all other things being equal, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to the less powerful group. Aww. So if it's between a privileged group and an underprivileged group, and it's a wash, it's a toss-up, it's 50-50, I'm going to side with the less powerful group.
So the answer to the question was nothing. You just totally dodged the question. This reminds me of when you're told in an interview, and what is one of your negative aspects? Turn it into a positive. Tell them that you're so good that it affects you. You're so good to everyone that it slows you down or something. That's what this is. That was a dodge. That was nonsense. Give one example of that ever happening, where there was somewhere in your studies somewhere, you came across an example of, did Jesus actually resurrect or did he not resurrect? I wonder if I choose that he did resurrect, I wonder if that's going to help feed the poor. No, it's not. So, and I'll say he didn't resurrect. When did that ever happen?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to be aware of their biases and to not completely deny the fact that there's any biases.
And I think I would also say, like everybody, I have my own personal biases. If I publish an argument, I want that argument to be right, and so it'll be a little more difficult for me to think critically if somebody comes in later and says, "Aha, here's the flaw in your argument." I'm going to be a little less eager to accept that argument, and that's a bias that I'm always going to be struggling against. But I am aware of it in case anybody is doubtful.
Right. Is there any evidence that places the creation of the Torah in the Hellenistic era?
There have been some theories about that, but it's not the composition of the Torah. It is the consolidation of all these traditions and texts together, and their arrangement. That almost certainly took place in the Hellenistic era. So, for instance, like the book of Genesis has some of the oldest poetry in all the Hebrew Bible, may go back to 1000 BCE, like Genesis 49.
To use Dan's own phrase, that is pure and utter nonsense, based off nothing. I don't even know where he got that from. Tried to look it up. The only sources or anything close to that I found of Genesis 49 dating back to 1000 BC was from weird biblical websites. Nothing and that I can find that was scholarly. I beg the listener who's watching this, ask him, what are you talking about? What are you talking about Genesis 49 being the oldest poetry in all of the Hebrew Bible? Where did you get this from? 1000 BC at that point. Just to give you a quote from Israel Finkelstein, The Forgotten Kingdom. In his concluding remarks in chapter 3, Israel and Judah, he writes, assembling all available data for scribal activity in Israel and Judah reveals no evidence of writing before approximately 800 BCE. In fact, it shows that meaningful writing in Israel began in the first half of the 8th century, while in Judah, it commenced only in the late 8th and more so in the 7th century BCE. Past ideas regarding the date of compilation of biblical texts were based on the testimony of the Bible, and hence fell prey to circular reasoning. Recent archaeological and biblical research has made it clear that no biblical text could have been written before circa 800 BCE in Israel and about a century later in Judah. This means that the earliest northern texts, such as the core of the Jacob cycle in Genesis, were probably put in writing in the first half of the 8th century, during the period of prosperity of Israel, especially under the long reign of Jeroboam II. This indicates, in turn, that 9th century BCE and earlier memories could have been preserved and transmitted only in oral form. Now remember, what he's talking about here, it's what is even possible. He's basically saying that this is the farthest possible time period that these texts could have shown up in. I don't know where 1000 BC even comes from. Not only that, there is no evidence of the 12 tribes of Israel being mentioned in any language anywhere, not just in Greek, but in Hebrew, Aramaic, Egyptian, Babylonian text, Phoenician text, Punic text, any language in any writing system. There's not a single mention of the 12 tribes of Israel anywhere until the Hellenistic period. There are mentions of certain tribe names. You do get Judah. You do get mentions of Benjamin. They never have a list of the 12 tribes. Some of the 12 tribes that are only found in the Bible are never found in any archaeological record. So we don't even know if the 12 tribes is even a historical thing. So the idea that Genesis 49, which by the way, if we look at Genesis 49, it's about Jacob blessing his 12 sons. It mentions Reuben. It mentions Simeon and Levi. It mentions Judah. It mentions Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph. All of this stuff has no citations or any mentions of it existing anywhere. So the idea that these texts have some of the oldest poetry in the Bible that we can date to maybe 1000 BC is pure and utter nonsense based on pure dogma. No data supports this at all.
It also has some traditions that are post-exilic that come from around maybe the late 6th or the 5th century BCE. It probably did not take the shape that we know it now, more or less, until probably around 300 or 200 BCE. So these texts and these traditions all have very, very long lives. But I think that the actual arrangement of the 5 books of the Pentateuch in the way we have it now, that probably did take place during the Hellenistic era. However, the stories in them, and many of them in the actual textual form in which we now have them, probably existed for several years prior to that.
Yeah, I watched a video with the guy Gad Barnea, and he says that he insists that the Torah was at 300 BC or later.
For me, researching this, It's always about lifting the hood and looking what is the reality on the ground. Now, historically, it is so clear and so conspicuous that up until, the library was established late, really till tail end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria. Up until that moment, we see no, as I said several times already today, zero evidence of any type of knowledge of the Bible anywhere in any of the Jewish diaspora, whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Judea, Samaria, etc. No one knows anything. There are no names that are related to the Bible. There are nothing. No one. It's simply not in existence. This changes at the beginning of the 3rd century so clearly. We start seeing those names appearing in the lists of names in the onomasticon. We start seeing Kateos of Abdera, or whatever text that we have there. We start seeing people at that time, around the time of the museum. People start knowing something about the Bible, referring to the Bible. It is so clear that there was a shift around that time, and as a historian, I look for triggers. What causes change in history, and you need to find the trigger. And the trigger, this library in Alexandria is such a clear trigger, such a major trigger. And you see it in the archaeological record so clearly. There's nothing before and it starts after. That I think it's really hard to argue with that.
And usually these scholars are talking about when it all came together in the shape that we have it now.
Okay. Which is close to the Septuagint.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Very close.
Relatively close.
Yeah. Within a century.
Within a century.
Yeah.
Okay. And just so you know, that's how you date a text, period. We don't date the Vedas based on how far back we can find little pieces of the Vedas. We don't say, oh, we found this part of the Vedas that seems to be archaic, probably some Proto-Indo-European Avestan terminology going on here. So we're going to date the entire Vedas now to 2000 BC. We don't do that. You date the Vedas in its final form. For Homer, we date Homer to around 800 BCE. How do we know that? People are citing Homer in the 7th century BC. So we have a time where people are mentioning Homer and the Iliad, and we have a time where we can say, oh, look, it's in the sources, it's in the archaeology. Now, Homer, inside Homer's Iliad, there are archaic poetry that seems to go back to Mycenaean periods. There are mentions of characters and mythologies that we find in the records of the Mycenaeans. But we don't date Homer to the Mycenaean period because of that. That would be biased religious thinking. And then you can talk about those, you can have those conversations about the nuances of there are parts of the Vedas that seem to be archaic. But you would never just go, oh, hold on a second. Yeah, we can date the Vedas to 1000, but we should make sure everyone knows that part of it's older. That's dogma. You only find this type of rhetoric in certain Bible scholar circles that are trying to make the Bible older than it actually is.
Here's another thing I don't understand.
Yeah.
Moses. So the first time Moses is written about is Hectaeus of Abdera.
Outside the Bible.
Yeah.
That was talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
Hecataeus.
This was like 320 BC or something, 300
Somewhere
something
in that.
BC.
Yeah.
So how come we don't have any mention of Moses between when he supposedly existed 1200 BC up until 300 BC?
So most scholars would say the Moses tradition probably started being written down in the 700s, maybe the late 800s BCE, but probably in the 700s BCE.
Well, they are probably writing the Moses stories down sometime in the 700s BC. What would you say to that?
So when I hear a claim of that sort of, or any claim about when, let's say, a biblical text was written, the first question that I'll ask is, how do you know that? And I expect an answer that's compelling. The answer can't be, well, most scholars think that, whatever.
Most scholars would say
I will continue and I will ask, well, how do these scholars know that?
Right.
In good historical work, you need to show evidence for any claim that you make, right? If you have an hypothesis that a certain text was written at a certain time by a certain person in a certain place, you need to provide evidence to support this hypothesis. You need to, even more important, you need to try to bring evidence which will not knock that hypothesis off its base. And if we don't succeed in doing that, if we're not able to knock off the hypothesis, then we might end up in a situation where we can say, okay, we have good reason to think that this might be the case. We cannot simply come up with an idea and run with it, right? You need to have evidence. So that's good historical scholarship. There is bad historical scholarship out there where this isn't done. So that's, it's unfortunate, but there is bad historical scholarship. Just because somebody has a Ph.D., just because somebody is a professor in a university, doesn't necessarily mean that they're always doing the most careful scholarship. So, yeah.
But probably in the 700s BCE, and up until we get to the Greco-Roman period, there's not a lot of interaction between these cultures. So the classical authors who are away in Greece, they're not really interacting with what's going on in Jerusalem. They may know about it. There are some travel logs, people who are traveling through and taking note of some general traditions. But yeah, I don't think it's a huge surprise that we don't hear about Moses until the Hellenistic period.
Dan didn't answer the question there. The question wasn't about when the Greeks start finding out about Moses. Danny asked Dan, when does anyone mention Moses? In any language. Dan seems to think, oh, I'm not surprised that he's not found in the Greeks. They're different people in a different land. And how are they going to know about it? No.
Have any mention of Moses
in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Egyptian, in Babylonian, in Phoenician, in Punic, in Hittite, whatever you want to call it. I don't even care. Name a language. Moses does not show up in any single text anywhere until the Hellenistic period.
So Hectaeus of Abdera is 300. You're saying there's someone else who wrote about it in 700?
Not somebody outside the Bible. I'm saying the account in the book of Exodus probably comes from the 700s originally, not as we have it now, but the Moses tradition probably originates in the 700s.
So
all right, let's see it. Like you always say, all right, let's see it. Show us some evidence from the 700s about Moses. I'll wait. Just in case anyone says this is an argument from silence, it's not. We have thousands of papyri and ostraca in Aramaic written by Jewish communities from this time period that never mention Moses, ever.
There's a book called The Origins of Judaism by Jonathan Adler that was recently published that argues that we don't see widespread knowledge within the people of Judea of the laws of the Torah and their enforcement until the middle of the 2nd century BCE. So like 160s is when you start to see widespread avoidance of pork.
And that's because the evidence points to this text showing up in the Hellenistic era. In fact, it's so bad that we don't even find a synagogue. Not one synagogue shows up in the archaeological record until like 175 BCE. And there's nobody even following any of the Deuteronomy laws, according to Jonathan Adler and Gad Barnea, until the Maccabean period. So whatever this religion is, no one knows about it, and no one's even practicing it until way later in the Hellenistic era. So if this text did exist, who was it written for? It just doesn't make any sense.
Like, if you are trying to start a religion and you are trying to develop a way of life and to somehow evolve your society, right, with a religion. This goes back to like Plato's Noble Lie. You don't want to have it being based on drugs. You want to have some sort of a positive outlook. You want it to be positive. You don't want it to focus on things like this. Maybe they wanted to later when Christianity came about. Maybe they wanted to change it to make it fit a different sort of narrative.
Maybe, and I'm sure there were folks who thought of drug use as something positive, and so there's certainly I think there certainly would have been an audience for that kind of thing. But there's just no evidence within the literature, the other material remains, the history of early Christianity that supports that. Some of the earliest references we have to what the Christians were doing are just reports that they gather, they sing hymns, and this is a religion for women and slaves, and they don't do anything wrong, but they're just a bunch of superstitious weirdos.
I don't even know if I disagree with what Dan is saying here, but he's wrong about the evidence. There are sources that do suggest that some of this stuff was going on. Now, it is being told by people who are saying that those are heretics. But if you're an academic trying to teach people the history, and you're saying that there's just no evidence of early Christianity, that's just wrong. Hippolytus, Book 5, Chapter 34, The System of Marcus and the Devices upon the Eucharistic Cup. He says, quote, "Partly by sleight of hand and partly by demons, deceive many from time to time, this heretic alleged that there resided in him the mightiest power from invisible and unnameable places, and very often, taking the cup, as if offering up the Eucharistic prayer, and prolonging to a greater length than usual the word of invocation, he would cause the appearance of a purple and sometimes of a red mixture, so that his dupes imagined that a certain grace descended and communicated to the potion a blood-red potency. The knave, however, at the time succeeded in escaping detection from many, but now, being convicted of the imposture, he will be forced to desist from it. For, infusing secretly into a mixture some drug that possessed the power of imparting such a color, as alluded above, uttering for considerable time nonsensical expressions, he was in the habit of waiting for the drug, obtaining a supply of moisture, might be dissolved, and being intermingled with the potion, might impart its color to it. The drugs, however, that possess a quality of furnishing this effect, we have previously mentioned in the book on magicians." Now, just in case anyone's wondering, this is just one random text about one random guy. No, Marcus, his particular Christian sect called the Marcosians, are responsible for spreading Christianity all the way into France. And the Marcosians were actually the biggest denomination in early Christianity in Europe for a long time. They are from the Valentinian. I'm not even saying that Amon's right and Dan is wrong, but I am saying that Dan's wrong about saying that there's no evidence that Amon is correct. There is texts that do suggest that drug use was going on in early Christianity. Dan's just not aware of it.
What is Christianity like when Christianity was developed? What did they say about the Eleusinian mysteries?
I don't know that we have much at all about that. I mean, not really.
Dan is just that meme where it says, "Tell me you don't know something without telling me you don't know something." That's Dan should have his face next to that meme at all times. That's what he always does. We have entire books about the Naesenes or Nacenes, however you want to pronounce it, and their ties to the Eleusinian and Phrygian mysteries. Entire passages about Christ being the fulfillment, if you will, of the Eleusinian mysteries. Here's a passage from Hippolytus. So this is an actual quote we have through Hippolytus that supposedly was spoken by the Nicene preacher. He says, "For earth, says the Greeks, was first to give forth man, thus bearing a goodly gift. For she wished to be the mother not of plants without feeling and wild beasts without sense, but of a gentle and God-loving animal. Hard it is, he says, to discover whether Alcmenius of the Boeotians came forth upon the Cephisian shore as the first of men, or whether the first men were the Idaean Curites, a divine race, or the Phrygian Corybantes, whom the sun saw first shooting up like trees, or whether Arcadia brought forth Pelasgus earlier than the moon, or Eleusis Diaulus, dweller in the Ararian field. This, he says, is he who has authority over life and death, of whom he says it is written, "Thou shalt rule them with a rod of iron." But the poet, wishing to adorn incomprehensible part of this blessed nature of the Logos, makes his rod not iron but golden, and he charms to sleep the eyes of the dead. He says and again awakens those sleepers who are stirred out of sleep and become suitors. Of these, he says, the scripture spoke, "Awake, thou sleepest, and arise, and Christ shall shine upon thee." This is the Christ, he says, who in all begotten things is the Son of Man, impressed with the image by the Logos, of whom no image can be made. This, he says, is the great and unspeakable mystery of the Eleusinians. Haye, kaye, seeing that all things are set under him. And this is the saying, their sound went forth into all the earth, just as Hermes waved the rod, and they followed gibbering. Out of the rock, he says, is said of Adamas. This, he says, is Adamas, the cornerstone, which has become the head of the corner. Just in case anyone's wondering, who's Adamas? Adamas is one of the primordial gods from the Samothracian mysteries. So there is a mixing going on here of these Eleusinian and Samothracian and also Phrygian mysteries being applied to Christ. There's a lot more in here about Eleusis and Christ that is mentioned by Hippolytus. Again, does this mean that the Christians are coming from the Eleusinian mysteries, or this is some secret Eleusinian offshoot? No. But the question that Dan was asked as an expert in the field is there any evidence of Christians mentioning the Eleusinian mysteries?
When Christianity was developed, what did they say about the Eleusinian mysteries?
He says no.
I don't know that we have much at all about that. I mean, not really.
That is just false. He doesn't know the sources, period.
There are some folks who think there may have been some overlap between Christianity and Mithraism, just because they were kind of both seen as mystery cults.
Now, when I saw this part in the interview, I was kind of surprised. Dan sort of has a track record of not knowing anything about Mithraism or Sol Invictus and just kind of winging it whenever the subject gets brought up. He'll cite books and then not know what's actually in the books, sometimes saying the opposite of what the books say, which has been something that I've experienced with Dan multiple times, which I'll get into. For example, this clip right here.
Now, Constantine also worshipped the sun god Mithras.
Mithraism was waning within Rome by this time period, despite an attempt by Diocletian to revive it, and Constantine seems to have been primarily dedicated to Sol Invictus, who had only been around Rome for a handful of decades.
That is utterly nonsense. First of all, Sol Invictus and Mithraism are the same Roman imperial cult. They're not a different cult. It is true that there is depictions of Sol and Mithras as twins. However, more often than not, I think I can think of 2 or 3 examples of the former. In the latter sense, Sol Invictus Mithras is one name. Sol Invictus, the highest god of the Roman imperial cult, takes on traits of Mithras. It is more of a Mithraic sun god. To separate those gods and say Mithraism was waning and Solon's on the rise is false. Not only is it false, he says that Sol Invictus was only around for a couple of decades.
And Constantine seems to have been primarily dedicated to Sol Invictus, who had only been around Rome for a handful of decades.
That is not true at all. We can find coins from Sol Invictus all the way back from the 2nd century. For example, here you have the inscription Sol Invicto Augusto, the invincible son Augusto, tracing all the way back to the 2nd century, probably around the year 190. The dedication that says to Sol Invictus, where the typical Sol Invictus with his sun crown and his cape, dedicated by the Equitus Singularis Augusti, the cavalry arm of the Praetorian Guard, dated to 150 CE. So the idea that this god is only a couple of decades old is complete and utter nonsense by an amateur who doesn't read the primary sources.
And scholars debate the degree to which Mithra had been subsumed into the cult of Sol Invictus. But if
Mithra was always a solar mediator god, going all the way back to the Vedic religion and the Mitanni Empire and the Persians. The article that Nothath wrote is only pertaining to the feast date. Antiochus the Seleucid set up an image of Helios Apollo Mithras, showing that Mithras was already a solar deity long before he became a Roman god. Plutarch makes it clear that the Roman Mithras was imported by the Cilician pirates who Pompey defeated.
And scholars debate the degree to which Mithra had been subsumed into the cult of Sol Invictus.
That was such a slick but dishonest little backpedal by saying scholars debate how much Mithras was subsumed into the cult of Sol Invictus. It's the same cult. It's the Roman imperial cult. Mithraism is the secret mysteries of the Roman imperial cult. Initiation 7 levels. Sol Invictus is the high god of this religion. It's Mithraic, but the god they worship is Sol Invictus.
If you want a great discussion of Constantine's religious sensibilities, Constantine and the Divine Mind is a good presentation of all of the data that we have regarding Constantine's religious beliefs.
Just to show you how bad he misrepresents this book, let me read it for you. In the book Constantine and the Divine Mind, Imperial Quest for Primitive Monotheism by Keegan Chandler, completely academic book, peer-reviewed from 2020. It's the progressive association of Christian and pagan monotheism during this period was certainly made easier by Christianity's striking similarities to Roman sun cults like that of Mithras. Both Christianity and Mithraism featured a revealed doctrine, an initiated brotherhood, a communal meal, and the promise of intimacy with the supreme God. Christian churches were typically built to face the rising sun, and Christians worshipped on the day of the sun, Sunday. Thanks to these similarities and others, some scholars have been prepared to conclude that the Roman pagans must have seen Christianity as yet another manifestation of solar monotheism. The blurring of the lines between the supreme deities of Christian and pagan monotheism was certainly in its early stages during the Severan dynasty, would become, as we will see, a preoccupation of Constantine's early reign. But a quarter century before Constantine took up the purple, pagan monotheism in the form of reinvigorated Sol Invictus cult would rise to prominence during the rule of Aurelian. This book says exactly the opposite of what Dan was trying to argue with this kid against. First of all, the book gives tons of examples of overlap between Roman imperial cult Mithraism and Christianity. It also explains how Aurelian had reformed Elagabalus from the Severan dynasty, who in turn was a reform of the sun god in the 2nd century. So the same Sol Invictus from the 2nd century coins is the same Sol Invictus for Aurelian. And Mithras, who's also a solar deity, is dissolved into Sol Invictus in a Platonic sense, as the book explained. Neoplatonic sense, the book says. It doesn't debate the degree, it just says that it happens. So why Dan brought this book into the discussion to debunk this kid? I don't know. It makes no sense. Maybe he thought it'd make him look smarter. But he totally misrepresented this book, because the book says the exact opposite of what he just said. This is not the first time Dan has cited a book and misrepresented it. Earlier this year on Twitter, I called out Dan for getting wrong Paul's idea of what God is. Dan McClellan tried to claim that Paul, in order to believe in one God having control over the cosmos, he would have to require creation ex nihilo, which is complete nonsense. Why would you need to require creation ex nihilo to believe in a God, like a Platonic God, like Plato's God, that dates back all the way to the 4th century BCE, that's found in Middle Platonism all the way in the 1st century BCE, that Philo worships a god like this? This is well known. And when I said this to him, he tried to gaslight me and said I'm misrepresenting the sources. I've read those sources. Here's 5 books that I'm gonna completely gaslight you on, And when I checked into those actual books, it turned out that the things that was in them was saying exactly what I was saying. When I came back to the table to show this to Dan McClellan, he pretended like it never happened, and he hasn't talked to me since. That's how Dan McClellan admits he's wrong. Once again, Dan's misrepresenting books, pretending he knows what he's talking about, and completely backpedaling on things and making it seem like he was right the whole time.
And then there's some who think there's a kind of a Bacchic background to Christianity. There may be some influence from the Bacchae on like the Gospel of Mark, for instance.
Actually, no, the Bacchae would be the Gospel of John. So you're a little off on that one, but I get what you're saying. I'm happy to see that you're actually presenting people with this type of material, which is actually very shocking to me.
Some of the ways that Jesus is represented in some of the Gospels kind of mirror.
What is Bacchic?
The Bacchae is a story associated with Dionysus and mysteries and people who dance and frolic and get drunk on wine and stuff like that.
Have you read the Bacchae? I mean, that happens in the Bacchae, kind of, but for that to be the answer of what he asked you what Bacchic means. Bacchic does not pertain to the Bacchae. The Bacchae is just one play. It's just a small piece of what we would consider to be Bacchic. But whatever. Maybe you misunderstood what his question was.
And the Bacchae is this famous piece of literature. And there have been scholars who suggest some of the imagery in some of the gospel accounts is riffing on what's going on in the Bacchic literature.
Yeah, the Bacchic literature is different than the Bacchae. I don't know if you know this. You're not making it clear that you are. You're making it seem like you don't know this. What we call Bacchic is a totally different thing. It has something to do with things that are pertaining to Dionysian, Orphic. Sometimes Orphica and Bacchica are used interchangeably, as we find from Greek Religion by Walter Burkitt. In chapter 6, he has a chapter called Bacchica and Orphica.
And some people see, particularly in the Johannine representation of Jesus, so Jesus in the Gospel of John, particularly his relationship with wine, kind of hints at Dionysus a little bit.
As Dennis MacDonald lays out in his Dionysian Gospel, it's more than just hinting at Dionysus. There's full-blown scenes where the sequence of events lines up and clear examples of mimesis happening. Not only that, the Epiphany of Christ, celebrated by the Orthodox Church, happens on January 6th. The Epiphany of Dionysus, according to Pliny the Elder, not the younger, Pliny the Elder, the oldest first century source, actually talks about there being an Epiphany celebration of Dionysus on the night of January 5th into January 6th there, and they actually have a legend to go along with it where Dionysus turns jars of water into wine, where they seal the jars up at night, and when they come back in the morning on January 6th, they find that the jars are filled with wine. This happens on the same day of the year where the Epiphany scene of Christ is celebrated on. Not only that, the wedding at Cana was supposed to have happened also on January 6th. To read more about this, there's an article from The Epiphany of Dionysus and Ellis and the Miracle of Wine. It actually goes through the sources that we get from Plutarch, Pausanias, and Pliny the Elder that reference this particular Epiphany of Dionysus happening on January 6th, the same day where there's an epiphany and wine miracle at Jesus Christ. So for anyone who just thinks it's just hinting at wine because they have wine involved, and wine is kind of like Bacchus, even though actually people thought wine really was the blood of Dionysus in some of these sources, then they just are not aware of the text. They're not immersed in the source material. They're spending way too much time on just the Bible and assuming that, you know, there's really nothing to see here, so I don't have to actually read these primary sources, and I don't have to read Plutarch, I don't have to read Pausanias, I don't have to read Pliny the Elder, I don't have to read anything. I'm just going to read the Bible and just going to listen to what these other Bible scholars tell me, and we're all just going to stick together. That's kind of the message I get from Dan.
So there's some ways some of the writers of the New Testament literature are pulling in some imagery from the Greco-Roman world and from the mythology to try to represent Jesus as kind of the true one who has all this power and is sovereign over all these different aspects of the world. And including the beginning of the Gospel of Mark may be riffing on something called the Preein inscription, which celebrates the good news, the gospel of the coming into the world of the god Augustus, because it uses a lot of the same terminology.
Well said, actually. Yeah, and just to add to what he just said there, you find this very similar birth narratives happening, where when Augustus, according to Suetonius and fragment from Julius Meritus from the 1st century BCE, about the birth of Augustus having a star signifying that a king of the world would be born, and they had to murder babies because they didn't want this to happen. That's very similar to what we find with King Herod and the star and the Magi. You also find something very similar in the sources from the 2nd century BCE about Mithridates VI also having a star signifying the king of the world would be born. There's like a grandiose genealogy that links him to both Cyrus and Alexander or something along those lines. It's not just in the mythology that Christ is drawing from. It's not just Greco-Roman philosophy or Greco-Roman mythology, let alone Old Testament motifs, but also from historical motifs as well, from other great figures like Alexander, Mithridates, and Caesar.
So I know that the terms, when it's talking about human trafficking wasn't from what I know from 1st century Rome, human trafficking wasn't one of the crimes that was punishable by crucifixion. It was the word that they use to describe the criminals. I think in the later text it calls them thieves, but they're brigands. They're because it was shoot, I'm forgetting the word.
Steve, maybe you can find that Greek word and we can punch it in that thing again.
Yeah, there's I'm trying to think of the English word. It was basically it's sedition that was punishable by
sedition
crucifixion. Yeah.
What does that mean?
So that's trying to revolt against the state.
Okay.
I don't know where he got this from or pulled this out of his ass, that there was some sort of list of what can be punishable by crucifixion. No, a governor of a Roman province can crucify anyone they want. They really have like the authority to do almost anything regarding punishments of non-Roman citizens. Maybe if he's talking about people who are Roman citizens who would be tried in court, but we're not talking about that with Jesus and the other Laestes. A non-Roman citizen, especially from not an imperial province, going to Judea, there's really no statutes in place protecting anybody from crucifixion from a governor or a prefect. So I don't know what Dan is even talking about here.
Are you familiar with Lucian?
Not very familiar now. It's been a while.
Now here's where people are going to think that I'm going too hard on Dan, but no. If you don't know who Lucian is, but you're the guy who's calling strikes and umps,
kind of position myself as a bit of an umpire calling balls and strikes up,
putting yourself out there as an expert in ancient religions when Lucian is the main source that we have for Syrian religion. The Syrian goddess was right. We have over 80 works of Lucian that have survived today. Huge library of stuff from Lucian. I mean, he's up there with Plutarch and a lot of these great writers from the 2nd century. To not know Lucian and call yourself a scholar of ancient religion is kind of pathetic. That's like me saying I'm an expert in Star Wars, and then someone's like, "Oh, Neil, what do you think about Jabba the Hutt?" And I'm like, "Jabba the who? I don't know who that is." To not know Lucian and then to call yourself someone who's going to call balls and strikes online for ancient religion?
An umpire calling balls and strikes up.
De Dia Syria is one of the most valuable texts that we have that survives to us from the 2nd century, which gives us a whole wealth of knowledge to sort of use alongside with the archaeology of different Nabatean practices, Arabian religion, Syrian religion. If you don't know Lucian, then you don't know any of this stuff. You're basically admitting that you don't know anything about Syrian religion, Nabatean religion, and Arabian religion. Because to say you know those things, you have to go through Lucian. Trying to wrap your head around this. Imagine I'm telling you I'm an expert in the Hebrew Bible. I'm an expert in the Hebrew Bible. Really? So what are your thoughts on Isaiah? Isaiah? Yeah, I don't know that guy. Who's that guy again? Remind me who that guy is again? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about him now. No, dude, you're done for. You can no longer call yourself an umpire calling balls and strikes for ancient religion people if you don't know Lucian.
So Lucian was another example of a writer. I think this was like 150. I could be wrong here. Steve, you have to fact check me on this. I think it was like 150 BC. Lucian was a poet, and he wrote a story about a guy named Alexander the False Prophet, who was a laestes. And he's using the context to how Alexander, the context that Lucian uses to describe this guy Alexander the False Prophet as this terrible, tyrannical laestes who's trafficking people and using them as like putting them into like prostitution rings and all kinds of stuff. I think he's using that for the main historical context for that passage in Mark where Jesus says, "I'm not a laestes."
Yeah, that's.
So that wouldn't be relevant to what was going on the ground in that part of the world.
Because we're talking 200 years later, 200 plus years later, and a different part of the world and a different type of literature altogether.
Can you Google Lucian so we can actually get the real story about what his deal was when he was? Sorry.
But yeah, you need to be able to show that this usage is actually going on in the text you're looking at, you're asserting where it's occurring. But I don't think there's anything in the New Testament that can plausibly
scroll down about there you go.
The old
125
Wikipedia.
Okay, so
that is CE.
What is CE? What does that mean?
So that's AD.
That's AD, right?
So this is
a satirist.
After. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is saying he was 125 to 180 AD. Right. Okay. So roughly about 100 years and change after.
Well,
Jesus.
less than that for the actual composition of the Gospels. So their Gospels are 70 CE to maybe 125 CE.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So that's
around the same
closer
time.
In time. Yeah, it's much similar, but
that's also, ooh, this is embarrassing because not only are we 200 plus years off, Lucian of Samosata turns out to be in the exact same century as Christianity, from the exact same part of the world, in the exact same language. Whoopsies!
So where did Lucian come from? Was he not in the same area?
He's close to the same area.
Can you scroll down?
I don't know where he was living when he was writing, but I know he's...
Does it show you where he lived?
Syria.
Roman Syria?
He was born in Roman Syria, died in looks like Egypt. So it was near the same area. But yeah.
Same area, same time.
Yeah, but the context is what's most important there. And I got to come up with some more off the cuff examples of contextual differences and contextual uses.
Awkward right there. Whether him or Amon is correct is beside the point of what I'm trying to get at in this, is that he just doesn't know what he's saying at all. Why didn't you just say, I don't know who Lucian is, so I really don't know, we have to look into it? Why did you make some sort of stance up on the spot? Now I think that's what you do all the time.
It seems to be a controversial idea that there are any pagan influences in Christianity. Is this the case?
Yeah, it depends on the degree to which people argue for pagan influence. But yeah, it's controversial.
I agree for the most part that a lot of these memes that go around about December 25th, various gods that are all crucified, born of virgins, all of them wore crowns of thorns, they all resurrected 3 days later. That's all nonsense. We all agree on that. But my problem with Dan is that he doesn't know anything about these Greek texts or Greek mythology or Greek philosophy or Roman theology or anything. It's not Hebrew Bible. Instead of just deferring to other experts on what they say, because there's tons of material from the books that I've listed before who do point out that there are, in fact, really good and strong parallels between early Christianity and some of these other different religions that are happening in the 2nd century, like the Ion cult. Dan never points to any of that stuff. It's always just, that's zeitgeist, that's bad, that's wrong. He lumps it all into one category. And then anybody like myself or Derek Lambert from Myth Vision who tries to shed light on some of this other scholarship that's not getting heard immediately gets condemned as Dan McClellan and Bart Ehrman are debunked this. Well, Dan McClellan and Bart Ehrman aren't experts in any of these subjects. Their opinions on this is literally meaningless to me, especially after what you just saw in all the last half an hour to 45 minutes of this video, not knowing anything of what he's talking about, getting things wrong, not defining things right, not knowing certain Greek terms, not knowing who certain people are that are important in this time period. So why he's the one calling balls and strikes in this is beyond my comprehension.
How much pagan influence do you believe is in Christianity?
I think there was probably a little. A lot of people who came into Christianity are coming from other traditions where they're going to keep doing some of the things that they're doing. And like even today, you can visit different parts of the world and Christianity is practiced in different ways because of frequently the preservation of indigenous traditions and conventions that they just carried on. And so Christianity is not a monolith. There are a lot of different ways around the world and throughout time to be a Christian. And in the earliest generations of Christianity, I think there was definitely influence from the Greco-Roman world. A lot of Greek philosophy gets into Christianity. I think there's probably more influence from Greek philosophy than Greek mythology or paganism.
That I would agree with, because there is no such thing as paganism. And I'm not even going to fault him for saying that, because he probably would agree with me on that too, and that he's just using the term as we know it. Paganism is basically just anything that's not Judeo-Christianity, because nobody actually says we're the pagan religion. There's various cults, such as Samothracian mysteries, Phrygian mysteries, Eleusinian mysteries, Egyptian Hermetic mysteries, the Roman imperial cult, all these different cults that we would call pagan, but they don't call themselves pagan. But here's the thing. You can't just separate the Greek philosophy from the Greek religion. They're intertangled in such a way that they're inseparable. But I get what he's saying. He's basically saying the Middle Platonist theology of pre-Socratic monism, that type of philosophy, is what we find in Judeo-Christianity more than we would find, for example, the god Dionysus showing up in the text talking to Jesus. You just don't see that.
But yeah, it depends on what you're looking at, whether you're looking at ideas about divine mediation, what the gods are like, where humans come from, morality, all that kind of stuff.
So first of all, I don't understand why is that controversial in the first place? So is the idea that Christianity was just this new thing that developed in its own bubble that was completely in a vacuum from everything else? Why is that so defended?
Such a good question, by the way, because it's exactly what Dan does in his scholarship, is puts Christianity in a bubble by itself, special, doesn't have any other influences. It's what we see from particular Bible scholars, especially who are more on the apologetic side, where Christianity is this special religion in a bubble with a force field around it, and all these other yucky pagan religions have nothing to do with what's going on in Christianity, and it needs to be defended from that at all costs. Any text that you find that look like Christianity probably was borrowing the other way around.
Because most people who identify as Christian believe that this way of life, this whole package, is something that was delivered by God. And so they want to minimize the degree to which social circumstances are influencing it. Most thoughtful people will recognize there's some degree of influence from the world around them. but there are usually a handful of non-negotiable features of their belief that they want to have dropped ex nihilo from the heavens, that this is pure revelation, this is pure inspiration, there is no borrowing or influence from paganism.
Okay.
So people tend to be pretty sensitive about that.
It's very weird to me that Dan is talking about other people as if he's not the one that actually engages in this type of behavior, where he has non-negotiable things that I see. Number one, the Old Testament has to go back all the way to the 1000 BC for some reason. That's non-negotiable. Doesn't matter what the evidence says. Doesn't matter what the evidence on the ground is. But no matter what we find, no matter what goes against what I need to be true, that has to be true. Number one, the Old Testament is super old. And number two, Christianity is not borrowing from any paganism. And if it does, we're just going to have to separate that and call it philosophy or theology. But it can't be paganism. It can't be that word, that dirty word. It can't be the cults. It has to be the philosophers like Philo or Plato or Cicero. Cannot be Homer. No way. Can't be Homer. Can't be Hesiod.
What about the idea of gods that die and resurrect? Like Persephone, Osiris.
Yeah,
there's a ton of them.
So the idea that this is like a discrete category of deity, the dying and rising God, comes from Fraser from the 19th century, and it's an outdated anthropological model.
It's an outdated anthropological model, according to Dan McClellan, the expert on anthropology, I assume. But that's funny, because when I actually go to current professors in anthropology and ask them what they think about this, here's what I get.
Your doctoral thesis revolved around the concept of dying God, right? And the presence of gods with this feature in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. Could you share with us some of your major findings?
Well, I think the most important is that the dying God does exist, because, as you know, this category is very controversial. So now the position is that it was a wrong idea, that the dying God does not exist. There was a misunderstanding. But studying especially some texts, again from Mesopotamia and from Near Eastern tradition, texts from Greece too about Dionysus. So studying these texts and these myths and this tradition, I found out that the dying God exists, actually. It's very curious that these three gods from Mesopotamia, Ugarit and Greece, Osea from Mesopotamia, from Near East and from Greece, which are the most certain example of a god who dies and comes back, are ignored usually. So they are the gods who are usually not studied and not put into the category. And they are the only one with whom we have certain proofs that there is the death of the god involved. So I would say that this is the major finding, the existence of this figure.
Yeah, but this way of classificating as to God, certain gods by this particular feature, where does it come from?
Well, the category of dying gods it existed before, but it's famous thanks to Fraser and his big The Golden Bough, which is a beautiful. Well, there are several books about magic and religion. And so he introduced this category, and he was studying especially three gods and some others, and he was trying to find this kind of divine figure in other cultures. So there was a lot of criticism against this category. And some of this criticism is real. Now there are some problems with what he was saying about the dying god, but in my opinion, what he said in general was correct.
That is used to try to, like, if this is a discrete category, if you can define it by these features and then Jesus fits the definition, then you can just say, well, Jesus is just one of these other deities, just like these other deities. It's kind of an archetype. It's just the way people create deities. And that also means that Christianity is just kind of a product of the natural interaction of human cognition and the environment around them, which also kind of desacralizes things. So for people who are Christians, they tend to be pretty sensitive about that as well.
So this is actually a complete lack of understanding of this topic, because there's a lot more nuance here about the dying and rising God concept that's not being explained well in this particular podcast.
But scholars these days don't really think of the dying and rising God motif as something that has much analytical value.
So Tryggva Mettinger in 2001 wrote about this category, saying that the category, in his opinion, is a valid one, but that the consensus is that the category itself is inappropriate. In 2009, the Encyclopedia of Psychology and Religion summarizes that the current scholarly consensus was ambiguous, that some scholars reject Fraser's broad universal category, but some prefer it, and some preferring to emphasize the differences between the various traditions. And others continue to view the category as completely applicable. So the idea that this is like a dead category from, and he says
from the 19th century.
The first publication of the Golden Bog sure is in 1890, but the abridged version doesn't come around until 1922, which is the current up-to-date book that we have today, the final product of James Fraser's Golden Bog. I don't even know if he's ever read the book. I highly doubt. Actually, I know he hasn't read the book, and we'll get to that. He couldn't have read the book because of his response later when he gets to Hilaria.
No analytical value.
Not a lot of analytical value. Like you can point to some parallels, but when it comes to analyzing the rise of Christianity, I think most scholars who study that kind of thing would say the Jesus tradition doesn't seem to have been based on any dying and rising God motif. It more likely, the idea of Jesus dying and rising is just a relic of the fact that their Messiah died, was executed, and the only way for this tradition to carry on was for his followers to develop this tradition of his return to life. And so the fact that Jesus dies and rises is more incidentally related to the dying and rising God motif than it is inspired by it.
So it's more of a coincidence, you think?
Modern anthropologists, current professors in anthropology, such as Paola Correnti, who did her dissertation on James Fraser, says that not only is James Fraser correct, but the dying God is a completely valid category. And she writes about three in particular gods, Inanna, Baal, and Dionysus, who we're going to get into. Let's listen to her own words on this.
I think it's useless to just keep criticizing him, which is what people do usually. I think there is no point in doing this. So I was trying, it was very fascinating for me, these books and this category, so I started to investigate about it, and I found out that the first thing to do is to reorganize the category, which is not totally wrong. We just need to do a difference between the different deities who are involved into the process. And so again, Fraser talked about the gods that I studied, Baal, Dionysus, but he didn't treat Inanna, which is the Mesopotamian goddess, because in part he talked about these myths, but he couldn't have the text that we have now. So I think Inanna is the most important of these gods, and so my dissertation focuses basically on her and Baal. So I focused on them because no one pays attention to the text about them, which I think highly interesting, because they clearly talked about the death and resurrection, or coming back from death of these gods. So there is no way of denying the death or resurrection of God if you read the Ugaritic text about Baal or the Sumerian and Akkadian text about Inanna. And with Dionysus it's the same, although the case with Dionysus is more complex. I think that the category is working. We have just, we need to reorganize it, and that's what I was trying to do with my dissertation. So I think we have to make a difference between the way these gods die, because sometimes they don't die, they just disappear or they sleep, no? Instead of denying the entire category, I think it's more clever just to reorganize it. So we find that for the resurrection, they use the same word that indicate standing. For example, in Greek, the word which indicates the resurrection is the verb anistemi, which basically means standing. When you sleep in your bed and then you stand from the bed. That is the meaning of the verb. And then it was used for the resurrection. So about Jesus, for example, in the Greek text about the resurrection of Jesus, we find these verbs that then was translated into Latin, which is from where we take our resurrection, the word. And it's curious that in the text, in the Sumerian text, which is the most ancient that we have, we find the same word to indicate the resurrection of Inanna, the goddess. To say that she lives again, they use Sumerian verb to say to stand. So it's very interesting, this similarity, even in the use in the language, in the words. And sometimes, especially in certain field of studying, scholars don't like theories or classification. And the case with dying gods is a very good example, because they just deny it and say, no, it's not good doing generalization or categories. Why not? I mean, we study something, we want to understand what we are studying, and in order to do that, we have to theories and categories about things. But it's not something that all people or all scholars like.
And Paola Carenti, who has her dissertation written on this subject, is in some ways an authority on this subject. Bible scholars like Dan McClellan, Bart Ehrman, Frank Turek, or whoever do not have the expertise to even speak on this subject. But just as Paula is saying in this clip right here, scholars do not like this. Even though they don't know the primary sources, they act like they're walking encyclopedias that know all the sources, but they don't, and they just get it wrong and embarrass themselves.
And rising gods, there's this idea that there were Mesopotamian deities and other gods at the time. There was this idea that with the seasons they would die and then rise again, and that potentially Jesus was just kind of a copy pasting or a Jewish version of this notion, this idea of dying and rising deities.
Yeah, that's another one that's really overplayed. If you actually read these stories, first of all, you never have a human being who dies and comes back to life. Jesus in the Gospels is portrayed as a human being who comes back to life. He's raised from the dead, and that's not Dionysus. The gods who die, they're not gods who come back to earth. It's not a prominent theme in Greek and Roman religion. I don't know of a definitive case in Greek and Roman religion.
Romulus, for example, is not agricultural, and he does come back to earth. This is not even up for debate. This is not even an opinion thing. It's either true or false that there's an immortal who dies, becomes a god, and comes back to earth. The story of Romulus and Livy is not agricultural. It's a mortal who dies, becomes a god, and comes back to earth. For example, verse 1 of chapter 16, book 1. After these immortal achievements, Romulus held the view of his army at Caprade Palace. A violent thunderstorm suddenly arose and enveloped the king in so dense of a cloud that he was quite invisible to the assembly. From that hour, Romulus was no longer seen on earth. Then, in verse 3, those present hailed Romulus as a god, the son of God, the king and father of city of Rome. Then if you go down a little farther, it says, Proculus Julius speaks and says, at the break of dawn today, the father of the city suddenly descended from heaven and appeared to me. How much clearer does it have to be? Bart Ehrman doesn't know the primary sources, and most seminarians don't either.
The gods who die, they're not gods who come back to Earth.
So what do you do with that? That's in Livy, by the way. That's in the 1st century BC. These Bible scholars just don't know the primary sources.
We have numerous stories of dying and rising gods through history.
No, we don't.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, like who? We got a few dying and rising figures. Okay, we got a few dying and rising figures in the Near Eastern Mediterranean world, but these are
Dionysus. Dionysus.
Yeah, but it's very, very different. These are all very different. In fact,
of course they're different.
Superman cannot influence Batman because Batman wears a black outfit and Superman has a red outfit. So there's no way Superman and Batman can influence each other. That's impossible. Frank Turek, consensus among modern scholars nearly universal is that there were no dying and rising gods that preceded Christianity. They all post-dated the 1st century. Dr. Josh Bowen, Syriologist, responds straight to the jugular with, how are we defining dying and rising God? Inanna dies in the netherworld, is brought back to life after being mourned for 3 days and 3 nights. Enki sends the Galater and the Kurgara with the plant and water of life to bring her back to life. And I just want to say one thing about this idea that they're all different, therefore Christianity can't be inspired from. Why? Just ask yourself this. If they're all different, if they all have their own unique spins on them, if some of them are agricultural, some of them are not, why is it that Christianity can't be inspired by an agricultural dying and rising deity? For some odd reason, which is like Twilight Zone level weird, there's this idea that if a myth's agricultural, then Christianity can't draw from it. Do you know that agricultural revives itself at the spring equinox, same time as the Passover? Just throwing that out there.
Because when we think about resurrection, our first thought goes to Jesus. Of course, it's normal. But it does not mean that before Jesus, there is no proof that before Jesus, gods couldn't resurrect. Why not? The problem is that we are using the resurrection, the way we know it in Christianity, and resurrection in Christianity as certain features. And we are using what we know about Christian resurrection to culture who are more ancient. We can do that. We have to understand what this ancient civilization would understand from resurrection, or would express with the resurrection, and we have to see if we can apply the same word to them. But I am not a fan of this fashion now of rethinking about words. Words are not correct, we have to change the word. No, I think that we use the word resurrection, we know the word resurrection, right, with the case of Jesus, and we can use this word, and we can apply this word to other gods. And we just explain what this word means for the other gods and what this other civilization would have understand for resurrection. And I don't see the need of changing the word. We are used to it, so it's part of our tradition. So we can use it, we just would make the differences between resurrection in the case of Jesus and resurrection in the case of our gods. And that's it. There is no confusion because we can understand the differences. So we just say it. But in the case, I studied the word resurrection in different traditions, and again I see that it's the same word. So the fact that they would use the same word means something, right? Otherwise they would have used another one. So I guess that at the beginning, they as a Judaism and Christianity, they would perceive the resurrection of Jesus in a way that was very similar, not the same, similar to the resurrection of the other gods. But then, of course, there is I mean, Jesus is such an important and particular figure. Everything concerned with it was with him. Is so special for him that we can't use it for other things. But it does not mean that the resurrection or death or didn't exist before. What did not exist, at least in Near East, at least for what we know, it was the association of the resurrection of gods with the resurrection of the human beings. This aspect was absent from, at least from Mesopotamian sources and Ugaritic sources. It was not totally absent from Greek tradition, for example. So yes, there is a difference, of course. But I think the important thing is to explain things, not just to deny them. There is no point of doing this because you just say the things in the clearest way so people understand, and that's it. Comparison can be complex because you need to know several languages, several different cultures and traditions.
I just want you as the audience, don't listen to me. If we're going to trust the experts here, who do we go to? The Bible scholar who doesn't know basic concepts like what Bacchic is, or who Lucian is, or who's never heard of the Hilaria Festival, who's never read James Frazer, who just basically has like barely a 101 understanding on Greco-Roman religion, or a current professor of anthropology who wrote their dissertation on the dying and rising concept. Who should we listen to here?
I think it's more likely that the whole resurrection motif is an outgrowth of Jesus's followers trying to cope than it is with... because usually when people are suggesting Jesus is part of the dying and rising God tradition, this is a part of a mythicist approach. The idea that there was no historical Jesus, that it was all made up, and that it was patterned after the dying and rising God motif. That's usually where that argument is going, that it's there to support mythicism. I think most scholars agree that there was a historical person named Jesus who was an itinerant apocalyptic preacher who was executed by the Roman state. And then shortly afterwards, stories about him having come back to life began to circulate.
So I'm not even sure if he even knows about James Frazer, or if he's mixing him up with Alexander Hislop or something. That's what it sounds like. The way he talks about James Frazer, he might as well be talking about Alexander Hislop or Zeitgeist. It's like the same thing to him. There's literally no difference in the way he talks about James Frazer. It's like he thinks James Frazer is like the moon is cheese, or Alex Jones. Like, he doesn't not give any credibility to James Frazer at all, which is, to me, a sign of someone who's never actually read James Frazer.
So, and there are the ways the tradition doesn't fit the dying and rising God motif, but I think most scholars would say it's more likely incidental.
Right.
Gods who die and resurrect: Romulus, Attis, Adonis, Dionysus, Tammuz, Ishtar, Persephone, Osiris, Huankinthos, Melkart, Eshmun, Osiris, and Baal. And that's just to name ones that we know for sure. I mean, and it's not just agricultural deities either. Romulus has nothing to do with anything agricultural. Romulus is killed in the Senate by the senators at Rome and is taken up into heaven and placed at the right hand of Jupiter. But that's not also, there's a whole other category called the Katabasis and the Anabasis. And these are heroes that actually descend into Hades and then return triumphantly. In a sense, they become deified by this feat. So it's not just about dying or rising. It's also about descending and ascending.
Now, when Neil was on the show a couple weeks ago, he blew my mind with this thing, this festival, this ancient festival called the Hilaria Festival. And it was essentially like Easter before Christianity. Do you remember this, Steve? We could pull up the Wikipedia and we can read about it. But
Yeah,
do you remember what we were talking about? He was showing...
There's the Hilaria and Day of Merriment and Rejoicement. I can try to find some pictures.
Yeah. So what does this say? This says the Cybele, Attis cult, and in the Isis, Osiris cult, March 25th to November 3rd, respectively. It was one of the several days in the festival of Cybele that honored Attis, her son and lover. March 15th, his findings by Cybele among the reeds on the bank of the river Gallus, March 22nd, his self-mutilation, March 24th, fasting and mourning at his death, March 25th, the Hilaria, rejoicing at the resurrection. Some of the activities on the Hilaria resemble those associated with April Fool's Day, November 3rd, and Hilaria of the Isis-Osiris cult, marked by the resurrection of Osiris, the husband of Osiris. Yeah, I don't know. He was showing... we were on some other page where he was explaining to us the dates of this festival and how it has to do with resurrection. And there was like a Christmas tree. Remember that?
Yeah, they would bury a tree.
They would bury a pine tree.
So I never actually said anything about a Christmas tree. I did joke around and said it's kind of like a Christmas tree, but never did I say this is where Christmas trees come from or these are Christmas trees. I can't really fault Dan for that. It's just the way that Danny worded it. However, Dan McClellan is acting like he knows what this festival is, but the look on his face and his reaction and things he's saying show abundantly clear, especially based on his behavior, and he's very dishonest about being wrong about things. This is the third time in this video this has happened, where he just clearly has never heard of it before. This is the first time he's heard of it. I mean, if it's not obvious to you like it's obvious to me, this is the first time he's hearing about this festival. Well, I don't know.
And then
I'm looking for it.
And then what would happen?
I think it was just it was like a...
Have you ever heard of this?
Oh, I'm aware of the festival. Some of these details are a little fuzzy, though.
The idea is this was like a pagan festival that came before Christianity, and it's very, very similar to Easter, how it's depicted.
Yeah. Well, the date of March 25th that's is associated with when Christians determine when they believe Jesus was conceived, and then the traditional date of the resurrection associated as it was with the Passover.
He was conceived on March 25th?
So there was an idea in the ancient world, in some ancient biographies, if they didn't know when someone was born, they would associate the date of their death. If it was some kind of spectacular death, they would link that with the date of their birth. And with Jesus, he died. The traditional date of his death was March 25th, which was when the Passover was, more or less. Like these are movable things, but March 25th became the traditional date. And instead of associating that with Jesus' birth, they associated it with his conception. And this is where we get the date of December 25th for Christmas, because that would be 9 months later. And you see that in around 210 CE, I think, is when you have the first calculation of when December 25th was determined to be his birthday. But March 25th, that's much earlier.
I found a Hilaria. Funny enough, Wikipedia has more information.
Oh wow!
So way down in here, they talk about God.
Okay, the full this is I think what we were looking at before. The full festival that can be tentatively reconstructed as follows.
Oh yeah. You can. They talk about felling a tree at one point. A pine tree is felled. There it is. A tree is set up.
The tree is set up at the temple of Cybele.
Yeah.
Its trunk wrapped with wool, and its branches decked with wreaths and violets. Then a day of mourning the next day. Then a day later, the day of blood. Frenzied rites, including scourging and whipping. Castration rituals would take place on this day. Well, they certainly didn't follow that. That didn't make its way into the Bible.
Nuts.
The tree is symbolically buried. And then March 25th is the day of joy, celebrating the resurrection of Attis.
Again, showing absolutely no sign of having any knowledge of this festival. Now he's going to go on his phone and start looking things up for the next, 2 minutes straight. It's kind of funny to watch. It's kind of sad, though, that this guy is calling balls and strikes online, calling himself a religion expert, but he looks like he doesn't even have, basic understanding of major religion festivals from the ancient world.
This was the Hilaria proper, as opposed to the mournful tone of the previous days. Then 26 was a day of rest, and the next day was the washing, added by Marcus Aurelius. Interesting. Possible ceremony at the Vatican sanctuary appears in the calendar of Philocalus. Is that how you say that? Philocalus.
Philocalus.
Yeah, that's where we get the first reference to the celebration of Christmas.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is supposed to date.
Now, when was this festival happening, Steve?
This happened.
So Robert Turkin, The Cults of the Roman Empire, has written extensively on this, probably more than anyone in the world, anybody in the English language at all time. Probably the most authoritative text on this subject, just because of how deep he goes, how many primary sources are in here. Everything you need to know about the Hilaria festival can be found in the first chapter, Robert Turkin's The Cults of the Roman Empire. As far as the dates go, here's what he says. At all events, it was apparently Claudius Caesar who instituted and had inscribed in the Roman calendar a ceremony which, after a fashion, opened the Holy Week of the god Attis. The entry of the tree, henceforth, on March 22nd, the Brotherhood of Woodcutters, or Dendrophori, carried in procession to the Palatine Temple a pine tree felled in the memory of the tree at whose foot Attis had destroyed his virility. The festival implies at least part of the cycle of celebrations which, in later calendars, mark the second fortnight in March. March 15th, the Brotherhood of the Canophori went in procession through the streets, carrying reeds from the banks of the Elmo, and leading a 6-year-old bull on which the high priest sacrificed for the fertility in the mountain fields. This was the beginning of 9 days of penitence, sort of like Lent. People abstained from bread, pomegranates, quinces, pork, fish, probably wine as well. On March 22nd, a pine tree had to be cut before the end of the night, and a ram was sacrificed, its blood bathing the roots of the tree. An image of Attis had been attached to it, decorated with the violets that his blood had caused to grow, according to the legend. The whole next day was given over to mourning, lamentations. On March 23rd, the Salii, priest dancers of the god Mars, went in procession, sounding their sacred trumpets, which received their annual blessing on this day. March 24th, Day of Blood, marks the peak of the mournful cycle. The high priest, with his Galli, gave the signal for wild dance in the sacred pine. He flagellated himself, and then with the whip, hung with knuckle bones, to the sound of curving clarinets and cymbals. Timbrels were beaten furiously. The people also beat their naked breasts with pine cones. After the cutting of the tree, on the third day, the holy ineffable harvest of Gallus was cut. On the following day, March 25th, the resurrection of Attis. So according to Robert Turkin, the Holy Week itself was instituted in the early to middle 1st century during the reign of Claudius in the 40s. However, most of the writing that we have does come from 4th century sources because we don't have much. However, I want to make this abundantly clear that during the reign of Marcus Aurelius in 160s, he adds a day of washing to the week on March 27th, which means the Holy Week up until March 26th had to have already been there, making it almost abundantly clear that the death and resurrection of Attis at least existed before Marcus Aurelius started in the time of Claudius.
This says Salastius, writing in the 4th century AD, described the basic multi-day structure of the festival.
But that was the writing. I remember it was
so
like
the writing was that late?
No, the writing about it was, but the actual event was way earlier. I don't remember.
It's got to be in there.
I remember we saw it. Maybe I typed in BC. No, it doesn't show up.
Now, when I was on this show last time, I did pull up sources that the cult of Cybele and Attis was imported to Rome in 200 BCE. Hilaria itself, which means the Holy Resurrection Week of Attis, was instituted by Claudius. However, spring equinox was still considered to be the time of Cybele and Attis. However, it just was in the first week of April, the Megalesia, And this is listed in the books of Ovid, Fasti. So the week of Megalesia was on the first week of April. It was dedicated to the Great Mother and Attis, listed in the book by Ovid.
BC. No, doesn't show up. I don't know.
Well, then how do we even know this was before Christianity? Sounds like it was.
I think he had a source.
Okay.
I don't remember.
Interesting. Well, it's very similar. It's very similar, right? The resurrection and...
I'd be interested to see what sources predate, because Easter is one of the first Christian celebrations that existed, and we have pretty early evidence for that. And I've never seen someone produce evidence that the celebration of Easter, either the date or the or whatever features of the celebration were associated with it were drawn from pagan sources. Normally, it is stuff that's coming from centuries later. And then the Christmas tree thing is interesting, because we know how the Christmas tree developed. That developed in the 1400s along a specific part of the Rhine from within Christianity. Like if they did the pine tree thing, that's unassociated. That has no relationship to Christmas, because Christmas trees don't even start being used by Christians for over 1,000 years after that.
1400.
And just to clarify, maybe Dan didn't know this. He might have got the impression that I was trying to make the claim that the Christmas tree comes from this. Never said that. I did joke about it and said they are similar, but I never made the claim that the Christmas tree comes from Attis.
Yeah. So,
to you, what in your experience, what do you think the biggest popular misconceptions are about Christianity?
There are a lot of them. I think one of them is the mythicist idea that there was no historical Jesus, that it was just stolen from pre-existing pagan stuff or from the existing astrology or things like that. That's something I confront frequently on social media. But I think that's limited to kind of a specific demographic. Most people aren't... It's usually folks who have some kind of ideological opposition to Christianity that are quicker to adopt a mythicist position.
Couldn't think of a better thing to end on. He couldn't think of anything else that is a misconception about Christianity other than mythicism. It seems to be the only thing on his mind. He makes videos about mythicism almost every week. He pulls up videos from the 1990s that are complete and utter nonsense that no one takes seriously, debunks them, and then wins awards for it. Just to give you an example of the nonsense that he's fighting out there, out in the trenches, just fighting the hard fight.
This is in the Bible.
Of course it
this
is.
is in the Bible.
Are you aware that there were 15 major theological religious movements in the world before Christianity that taught exactly the same identical story of a Messiah who came to the earth, who was born in a manger, who died on a cross, who had 12 apostles, who died with a crown of thorns? Are you aware that there were 15 major religions that had the same identical teachings of Christianity?
This is obviously complete bullshit. And I get why someone like Dan would want to refute this, but after like the 5th video of doing the same zeitgeist, that's December 25th, they all had a crown of thorns, and they all had 12 disciples, and they all did this, and they all did that. It just looks like this is lazy scholarship, not doing anything productive, going after low-hanging fruit, trying to score easy points, and then not knowing basic stuff. When actual true claims come along, like, for example, the idea of Dionysus being the sacrificial bull whose death brings salvation, who resurrects. That is a true statement. For some reason, if you believe that about Dionysus, that means you think Jesus didn't exist at all, and you're a mythicist and you have a bone to pick with Christianity. When in fact, you can still, and I'm talking about myself here, I still think there was a historical Jesus. I'm not sure if this is your religious bias doing this. I don't really know. I don't really care. All I know is you don't seem to know what you're talking about when it comes to Roman and Greek sources. And so that's why I made this video. To all the rest of you out there, this was something different, a little change up. You know, once in a while I do these polemics on people. Not often, but if you enjoyed this, I hope you did. You have just attained true gnosis.